the tail end remnants of a good old New England Yankee accent.
As I get more nervous, I'll come up.
But he's been in Canada and is a Canadian for years now. He did his master's and PhD here at UBC, his master's in oceanography on salmon bioenergetics, and his PhD with me on rainbow trout fishing lakes and vulnerability exchange dynamics involved in catchability of trout in recreational fisheries. He went on to do a postdoc on ecosystem modeling, ecosim stuff at the University of Wisconsin, working on the central North Pacific. And then got a job at SFU, one of my few offspring that actually got a real job.
But we're 200 universities lower than UBC.
So Sean does most of the stock assessment teaching and does a lot of stock assessment work for the government. I have no idea what that's about, because that is not Sean I know. So this will be good.
I will try not to disappoint you, Carl. I actually had a dream about this last night, that, when I finished my talk, he just shook his head and walked out.
It is possible.
Yeah.
Sean, see, I was taking Carl's chair. I'm running away.
Well, that was a better bio for myself, so I appreciate that introduction, Carl. And thanks for inviting me. As Carl described, my main interests have been in fishery stock assessment for pretty much since I was a student like you guys. And as part of that, I do a lot of collaboration with industry and kind of being the person who helps industry deal with government stock assessments and helping them develop them and things. And so this kind of thing, monitoring deep sea benthic communities is just, it's out of my league. But I happened to be the only one around when the fishing industry came looking for help in trying to assess fishing impacts on bottom communities. So later on I'll give you the story of how it got started, but I got involved in this and have since kind of taken it to just the ways that I found that I thought would be interesting. And I think it's starting to come into a pretty nice project now. So I'm going to talk about deep sea benthic communities, and for the most part we're talking about cold water corals and sponges, other types of species that live on the bottom that provide 3D habitat in some way for fish and other invertebrates, and different kinds of sponges. These organisms make up a lot of the biodiversity hotspots that you hear from around the world. They have relatively low regeneration times. They're not typically evolved to a lot of disturbance, and fishing gear obviously can create quite a bit of a disturbance. They're spread all over the world. They're also, they come under this category of vulnerable marine ecosystems. In Canada, we have a marine protected area strategy aimed at, part of it is aimed at protecting a lot of these types of ecosystems. And right now, we have less than 5% of our marine habitat is actually in marine protected areas, but part of this strategy is to get that number well up over 10%. And when that starts to happen, which I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Canada's Marine Protection Area Strategy, but it's a really slow moving kind of thing that probably will never come to fruition, but it still worries people, especially bottom contact fisheries. These are the fisheries that are right now pretty much among the most valuable in Canada and in British Columbia in particular. They generate over $200 million a year in revenue in different kinds of fish species. They are one of the main threats to sensitive. I'm going to use these different acronyms kind of all over the place, but for the most part, I'm going to talk about sensitive benthic areas generally. They're really the main threat to those, besides oil and gas development. But for the most part, it's mostly fishing. And so these fisheries are going to be the ones that are really going to be affected if a marine protected area strategy starts to occur on a fairly large scale. So in this talk, I'm going to present to you in the first part pretty much a traditional approach to assessing the possible impacts of fisheries on these kind of ecosystems. I'm going to look at our interaction between trawl fisheries and habitat forming species in Hecate Strait, which is a project that we did over the course of 3 years. It's basically using large-scale scientific research cruises and then looking at fishery habitat trade-off type analysis. And then I'm going to, that study kind of motivated us to look at a different way of doing things, and it spawned what I've probably poorly named the Seagrass Project, and I'll try to explain that as it happens. But the Seagrass Project is about doing this kind of fishery habitat work on a much larger scale than can be done by the traditional approach. It's looking at these interactions on the entire continental shelf slope and seamounts in a trap fishery that I've been working on for several years. It combines both scientific and commercial sampling platforms to really get the sampling power up. And it allows us to do a lot of interesting stuff, hopefully, that you'll see. As far as being able to model the effects of fishing gear impact on communities. I'm always looking for an excuse to build some kind of model, and in this case, I think I actually might have data to do it with. And then I'll finish up trying to basically convince you that ecosystem-based fisheries management is actually, it will become much more feasible in the future as we develop the new technology and data to try to implement it. So, a few years back, Jeremy Colley, I don't know if you guys know Jeremy Colley, but he was another former postdoc at UBC and pretty well known for his work in this field of fishing effects on benthic communities. He was doing a sabbatical and he was spending some time up at SFU with us, and I think the fishing industry heard he was there, so they came and were talking to him, but I happened to be the guy who was stuck with the project. And there were basically over 20 bottom contact fishing associations that were up against eco-certification constraints. So to get eco-certification nowadays, if you're familiar with that, you have to have some kind of assessment of your impact on bottom habitat. And so a lot of these fisheries were nervous about their ability to get these eco-certifications. So they came to us with two questions. One is to try to come up with a way to assess fishery scale risks to these sensitive benthic areas, and then look at the cost of reducing those risks where they occur. So these were the two main questions that guided an NSERC strategic project that I had a few years ago. So as I mentioned, our groundfish exports, a lot of the groundfish that's produced in British Columbia is exported, and more and more of it is coming to rely on eco-certification to get access to foreign markets. It's the same in Eastern Canada, where their market is Europe. A lot of ours is to the US and some parts of Asia. And those eco-certification assessments require these kinds of assessments. So this is the Canadian sablefish was certified under the Marine Stewardship Council in 2010. And over the course of the year, when it came to do their first annual audit, it was actually contested by the World Wildlife Fund and the Council of the Haida Nation, because they didn't agree with the way that this particular habitat indicator was scored in the assessment. They basically said that there wasn't information to assess risks posed to habitat types. That information wasn't available at the scale and intensity of the fishery, and it applied to both the coastal fishery and the seamount fishery on Bowie Seamount. This condition kind of came out of the blue. It triggered a whole bunch of audits from the Standards Association and things, but the Sablefish Association accepted it, the condition, and decided to do something about it. Since then, it's a side issue, but since then the Sablefish Association has dropped Marine Stewardship Council certification because it's so expensive to maintain, and projects like this, like developing this kind of information, cost an equal amount of money, and it's probably better spent. So, other significance of this kind of work that we were trying to get out of it was to provide some scientific support for the credibility, acceptability, and performance of marine protected areas. A lot of what you hear about marine protected areas is based on expert opinion, and the fishing industry doesn't really buy that. And so we wanted to create some actual data to try to make some more informed decisions. And the fishing industry is perfectly willing to alter their fishing behavior where necessary, but like I said, it should be based on science rather than expert opinion. So we took a traditional approach. We got a big academic grant. We applied for ship time, got rejected, had to go and scramble to get onto some DFO surveys. So we actually got 2 field seasons with with some help from Jim Boutillier at the Pacific Biological Station. We hired science crews and grad students, and we ended up doing 2 research cruises, 2 ROV cruises in Hecate Strait. That I'll show you some of the results of those in a minute. But the fundamental thing we were looking at was what is the impact of trawl fishing on these sensitive benthic areas. So the first thing we had to do is characterize the sort of the fishing risks across a particular area of Hecate Strait. So this is just a cartoon of a trawl, and the idea is that the trawl is dragged along the bottom, and it has a certain spread that allows you, if you know the start and end point of the tow, you can go and calculate the area that's been swept. So this is pretty standard fisheries stuff. Now this is an example here that if you took a particular patch of the ocean floor and gridded it off, and this is a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid, and you had the trawl start and end locations, you could basically put together these trawl tracks and figure out how much area, say within this grid cell, how much of that area has actually been contacted by a trawl, and how much of it has been contacted once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and so on. So we did this, and then we looked at how trawl fishing has changed over time in this particular area. So I'm going to show you a series of maps beginning in 1996 and going up to 2009. And this little legend shows you basically the amount of area that's been swept within those cells. So in 1996, you can see the fishery was fairly concentrated on a few fishing banks. So the fishery doesn't really uniformly sweep Hecate Strait multiple times a year. It's fairly concentrated and kind of spreads around there as it goes along. You can see most of this is red, which means it's fairly low intensity fishing. There's a couple of spots here where it gets a little bit more intense. One up here that there are some trawl tracks that happen to they might get hit 20, 30 times a year. So on as it goes along. And so one of the things you'll notice from this as time is going on, these will get more and more concentrated until you can see that it's getting more and more concentrated up on the banks, and the fishing effort is leaving some of those marginal areas. It's a bit more concentrated in there. So that by 2009, the fishery actually occupies quite a small footprint in Hecate Strait. There are some areas, of course, like up here on the top of these banks, are quite intense fishing, but for the most part, a lot of it is untouched. So that little time series that I just went through, each grid cell in this map has a time series of fishing effort associated with it. And so we applied some classification methods to try to break out for all these different grid cells what the fishing history was like. And so it turns out that 37% of the area within this box was never touched by a trawl over this particular period. About half of it, a little more than half of it, as you can see in the red, might have been touched once. 2% of it has actually been decreasing. The fishing effort has been decreasing over time. 4% is this really high intensity stuff on the tops of the banks. And there's been a couple of, a small percentage of areas where effort has actually been increasing. And if I was to replay that series of years again, what you would see is where it's been increasing is on the tops of the banks. So the fishery is really collapsing to the center of those banks. And so if we take those classifications of basically low, steady effort, decreasing effort, high, and increasing, the time series kind of break out like this, where there's a lot of them where there used to be 10, 20, say fishing mortality, area swept of about 10% a year, and then decreasing over time to where there are almost no fishing there. Other ones, different kinds of patterns go on here. So we put this information together and came up with a survey design to guide our field sampling, where we took those effort patterns and we used these kind of 4 classifications, and I think we had there's different kinds of substrate here. This is a substrate map of Hecate Strait, one of the few areas in British Columbia where we actually have this information. And you can see the greener, lighter areas are more the sand and mud, and as you get towards the red, it gets towards the harder bedrocks. And the more rock you have, the more opportunity you have for some of these habitat-forming species to grow. So we combine these two things with simple information on the depth, on the bathymetry in the area, and we came up with, I think we had this giant, array of possible areas to sample, and we came up with about 70 sample sites. And they're shown here on this chart. These black dots are some of the sample sites that we actually ended up choosing. So we went out and did the study, and our first year was quite successful. We got about 34, 35 transects done. There were 500-meter transects with an ROV. The students sat down and went through all the photographic data and analyzed it and everything. So one of the things that we found from this, we had these classifications of habitat types where there's a sand mud substrate shallow, sand mud substrate deep, and so on. Till shallow and till deep. Till is where a lot of these animals actually live. And so we found the usual thing is as more higher trawl swept area, you tend to have lower species diversity and lower occurrence of these sensitive benthic critters. And so this wasn't really surprising, but it was the first time somebody's done this in British Columbia, and one of the things it showed kind of supported the idea that in some areas like different types of sand muds, the trawl fishery doesn't really have a whole lot of impact, at least on habitat forming species, because a lot of them aren't really there. But then we got the review from hell, because in our second survey year, there were hurricane force winds up in this part of Hecate Strait. This is, in hindsight, not the greatest choice of place to go do something. So we basically got blown off the water in our second field season. We lost potentially 30 data points. And so one of the reviewers wasn't too happy with that, and that we'd have to go and collect more data. And I try not to do this when I review papers, is to tell people to go out and collect more data, because hundreds of thousands of dollars in years and all kinds of things, it just really isn't feasible. So this really set us back, and I swore off ever doing this again. So at the same time, we decided to just stick to modeling. A better thing to do. And so I had another student who was interested in looking at the second question, which was, what are the costs of reducing the risks to sensitive benthic habitat? So this is the same general area of northern Hecate Strait. These are some of those banks. Those fishing banks are in here where there's pretty high fishing effort. And so these are habitat suitability maps constructed from some historical records. These black dots are historical records of corals. A lot of them from museum records or from trawl surveys, things that come up in trawls and so on, that have been collected over the years. And then lots of different layers of information like bottom type, temperature, bottom flow, depth. A lot of that sort of information gets combined into these habitat suitability models. And then you get these kind of heat maps about where these things probably live. It's not a true probability distribution because the data here are presence only. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with presence modeling, but it's definitely not as good as presence absence. The absences here, a lot of them are really based on some sometimes dubious assumptions. But in any case, these do provide a reasonably good characterization of the distribution of corals. These are the hard corals, the big red tree corals that everybody likes. These are sponges of different types. Glass sponges, where there's a fairly large glass sponge reef down in there, but other types of sponges as well. And then there's sea whips. And the sea whips and sea pens, they don't look like corals because they're fairly soft. They look like big grass, but they're actually animals. And they tend to live on soft bottom. So these are the ones that can really interact a lot with bottom trawl fisheries on soft bottom for some of our flat fishes. So if your objective was to go out and protect these kinds of species, then the question might be, well, if you wanted to protect, let's say, 70% of the habitat for sea whips, what would that cost in terms of lost fishing opportunity and lost yield? So we did some spatial optimization modeling. So this is an example where we're protecting 70% of the best habitat for all three of these different types of organisms. If we tried to protect 70% of their best habitat in that area, what areas would remain open to fishing and what areas would be closed? So this is taking into account, you can just make out the grid resolution here. In each one of these squares, we have the catch, the trawl catch that came out of that area. It's for the probably, I think, the 16 major trawl species in the fishery. So this optimization is saying, what are the areas that we can close that have the least amount of impact on the losses in catch. So this is one example of one of those optimal solutions. And just as an example, on the right here, this is the current open area, this dark shading in the trawl fishery. That's the current available footprint that they can fish in. This is a long-term, this is closed quite a while ago, sponge reef, where there's no fishing allowed. And so you see these kinds of trade-offs, and Carl likes these kinds of trade-offs, right? These are the ones that you can actually do something about. What they're basically saying is that for a wide range of habitat protection, this is the proportion of the landings value that remains available, basically in the open cells. And so as you, oops, pressed the wrong button here. So as you go across, you can see if you wanted to protect only 30% of the best habitat, you'd have almost no effect on the fishery. You could go and close 30% and have very little lost catch. And that goes all the way across to where you really start to see some action happening when you get up over 60 to 70% protection. Then you start to see some costs in terms of lost fishery opportunity, and that depends on the species that you're after. So in this top one, these relationships depend a little bit on the range of data that you look at to summarize the trawl catch. And that's because the footprint of the fishery has changed quite a bit. So when you look at the long-term footprint of the fishery, you tend to see bigger impacts because they used to fish in much more area. And if you include those sea whips that cover a lot of that soft bottom, you tend to see the highest costs. And so in this case, you can see the Pacific Ocean perch comes off first, and then some of the flat fishes are up here. Basically because if you're protecting ground for hard corals and sponges, you're having very little effect on those flat fishes because they don't live there. And then if you take the sea whips out, it just changes a little bit, but it's not that sensitive to whether you have sea whips in it or not. But then if you look at the most recent trawl footprint, and this is the one from 2004 to 2011, when the fisheries really concentrated on the banks, you see there's almost no effect up until you get to almost 85, 90% protection before you start to have any real impact. So the reviewers like this one better, of course, because it's a modeling study. Now, I don't know if you guys are aware of the trawl fishery imposed its own restrictions. They called what's called freezing their footprint. So they went back and calculated all the trawl area since 1996, and they said, okay, we're not going to allow any fishing outside this historical footprint. And as I showed you earlier, they've already, restricted fishing a lot from that 1996 distribution. But under that particular footprint, these would be the effective protection levels. So for corals, this would be about between 40 and 50%, and sea whips be somewhere between 50 and 60%, and sponges around 50%. The current levels of protection by that footprint are about in that kind of range. Okay, so that's pretty much where that study is, and there's a few things we could do to improve that little trade-off study. We didn't look at the ability of fishermen to alter their behavior. If you close a cell, could be some obvious redistribution of fishing effort. There's a lot of complicated things that could go on if you started closing fishing locations. That we didn't really try to get into at this stage.
And Sean, the economics is quite basic, right? You're just looking at the landed values.
Yeah.
How about the cost of fishing? How will that be affected when you close 80% of it?
That's right. So we haven't looked at any of that. This was just the first cut. This would probably be, I would imagine, because it's not a massive scale of closures of altering the fishing, there is actually a pretty minor change in the fishing area. That those kind of things wouldn't be that big. But that's my prediction. So that's trawl fishing. And so we were also interested in looking at our longline trap and hook fisheries with the same kinds of questions. So this is just this is going to be something that you have to keep in your head until later, because I'm going to show you some video on this kind of trap gear on the bottom. So our trap fishery, mainly for sablefish, but we also have trap fisheries for prawn, crabs. Not sure if there's a shrimp trap fishery, but those work in this kind of way, where there's a buoy line from the surface down to an anchor, then there's a ground line to another anchor and another buoy line, and in between there are traps that hang off the ground line at different places. One of my students picked up this, and I keep telling him to revise it because this actually doesn't work this way. The ground line is actually, in these fisheries, the ground line goes from trap to trap and very rarely touches the bottom. This was one of the initial criticisms of trap fisheries, was they thought it actually worked like this, that the ground line laid along the bottom, and as the gear moved back and forth, it could basically shear off any kinds of corals and sponges, whatever was on the bottom, and act just like a trawl. And some of the fishermen that I've been working with said, well, it doesn't work that way because the line actually goes from the tops of traps and it floats, it's buoyant. And as I'll show you later, we actually discovered this when we put cameras down there, and we were able to show that, yeah, it actually doesn't drag along the bottom. So the actual footprint of trap gear is really related just to the traps, not really to the line, and the anchors, mainly to the traps. So these long line and trap fisheries, I think this is a bit bigger issue for these guys, even though they don't have the impact that the trawl fishery does. They're much more continuously distributed. This is all the fishing locations of the different types. So this is halibut longline, sablefish trap, lingcod dogfish, which is longline, and rockfish hook and line, which for the most part is trolling. This is basically everything that's not a trawl out there catching groundfish. And you can see they're fairly continuously distributed pretty much everywhere. They're up in the inlets. And if you added on top of this other fisheries like prawn and crab, you would fill up all these in. And it would be much more extensive footprint. And I'm not including Georgia Street. It's in there as well. And so naturally, with this more continuous distribution and the ability to put a long line somewhat precisely, they tend to fish in areas, where there could be a lot of corals and sponges. In fact, they can put them in very dense coral gardens. So there's more of an issue there, that more of a contact frequency issue. But in that case, it's also harder to quantify what the actual footprint is. You can't just take the start and end point and assume you're dragging a 70-meter wide trawl across it. Because what the long line does while it's deployed and while it's being hauled and retrieved depends on what the vessel is doing on the surface and the amount of weather on the surface. There's lots of things that can actually contribute to increasing that footprint. So we have a couple of problems when we try to do this. The first one is depth. So this is a picture from the top of Mount Seymour looking down, and so we're out here somewhere, but this is looking down on Vancouver. So it's about 1,000 meters, and a lot of these fisheries happen. Sablefish trap fishery occurs at 1,000 meters very easily. 1,000 to 1,200 meters is not unreasonable. And so trying to figure out what's going on down here from up here is a bit of a challenge, obviously. The second one is how to do this at the scale of the fishery. And so this is an example of, these are the survey locations for the sablefish trap fishery. And so this is all along the continental shelf and slope, which is a relatively huge area. The one I just showed you, the view from Mount Seymour, is right here looking down at Vancouver. So it's a fairly massive amount of area. And that's just for the sablefish trap fishery. That's not including all in Hecate Strait, for instance, and all the different inlets. So the scale of the problem is much larger. Little Hecate Strait study. So my recommendation to all you students is avoid this approach, which is the standard NSERC approach. Get your large research vessels, hire lots of people, spend $12,000 to $30,000 a day, which is what it costs us to run that project. And then when you're done, you get a very small data set that hopefully you get your small data set, or you get an even smaller data set. The vessels break down. I don't know if anybody's been on the Ricker, but I don't know. Does that thing run still? I don't know. And it's limited availability. For ship time, we actually got delayed a year because we had some problems getting ship time on some of these vessels. So it's all overprescribed as well. So this is where I have to thank Brett. It's going to be in my acknowledgements, but Brett was probably wondering, like, what are you talking about? What do I have to do? So Brett spent some time in my lab, and he had some interactions with my research technician at the time, John Martin. And so Brett came to me one day and he said, John is bored. He's really unhappy. He's really bored. And I knew John was kind of a hobby electronics guy. He was really into electronics and, had a home soldering machine and things. So I thought, why don't I see if I can get John to devise a camera that we can attach to fishing gear. So I had a meeting with John, and that got him all jazzed. He was very excited about that. So I gave him a credit card, and he went out and bought a GoPro camera and started hacking it in the lab. And I think he spent about 6 weeks, and he finally called me down to the lab, and there was a camera, some duct tape, and a piece of fishing line hanging out of a GoPro camera. And he said, watch this. And he shut off all the lights, and he jiggled it. The camera came on and made a video, and so we were like, we've done it. So we took that little prototype and we brought it to Nutco Research. I'm not sure if you guys know who they are, but they're on the North Shore, and they specialize in underwater dive equipment and technology. So we brought a very specific design to them for a bottom camera that was motion activated, programmable, good to depths of up to 2,000 meters, and it was really high definition, which ended up, we took this GoPro and stuffed it in a pretty heavy duty underwater housing and made it programmable. So thanks, Brett. Check is in the mail. The Canadian Sablefish Association put up $100,000 to build 6 or 8 of these, and another probably $100,000 in the pilot testing to get them going and get them working in the field. So we started this, and this was basically from the little duct tape and fishing line camera in the lab until we actually had this on the water in a survey context was about 6 months. So we called this the Sea Drops Project, and the idea is that this is basically a drop camera, and if we could attach this drop camera to, let's say, every set of fishing gear that went out, we would have information accumulating at this kind of rate. This is all that non-trawl fishing activity, but since 2007. So over the course of 4 or 5 years, our information would accumulate at this kind of rate, more than the NSERC 30 data points from this spot. So this is potentially a way to map these deep sea communities on a fairly massive scale. We could also do things like go and estimate the risks to these kinds of communities directly and not rely on large closed areas, and actually start to design some fairly specific fishing plans. We'd also be able to build some scientific capacity because we have a massive amount of data, and we could also discover some cool things. So this is the setup that we envisioned and we've since implemented. And so there's a programmable camera. This is the camera here, and this is it mounted in a sablefish trap. This trap is about 54 inches across, so a little less than 5 feet across on the bottom. And so the camera sits there. This panel is taken out, so you have a nice clear view, and the trap is unbaited, unless the crew wants to throw a bait bag in there. If they get bored, the crew usually puts a bait bag in, and then they get all kinds of fish to look at in the video at night. And then this is a temperature probe down here. So we're getting some temperature. The camera has, like I said, it's programmable. So when we put this out on a survey, for instance, the Sablefish survey, it fishes for 24 hours. So the camera comes on at the 22nd hour and starts recording video. And once it's activated, it can be motion activated as well. So if the gear starts to move, it'll start to pick up video as well. It'll also take audio, and it has all this other stuff. One of the things I'll show you later is that it also collects 3-axis acceleration. So just like the accelerometer that's in your phone that knows when your phone is upside down and turning, we can do all that stuff by having an accelerometer in that camera. So it tells us what the traps are doing. And it has a gyroscope and compass for other types of information about the orientation and movement. So since 2013, we've had over 250 drops throughout the coast, and including out here on Bowie Seamount, which I'll show you later. So you start to see some cool stuff like this. This is, well, I don't know, can anybody name these species? Yeah, that's a Pacific Grenadier, and you can see this guy just ate a shrimp. There's a bunch of, if you look closely, there's a bunch of little shrimp hiding in the rocks, trying to avoid these things, and that's probably the first time anybody's seen feeding behavior of Pacific Grenadiers. This is my favorite. This is a really big school of rough-eye rockfish, and the lights here will warm up in a second. But you can see all these guys sitting out here. I don't know how many would possibly be out there, but rough-eye rockfish, as you may know, are one of the longest-lived fish species known. These, I think the maximum age on these goes up to 205 years. This is at about 500 meters on Bowie Seamount, and you can see that it's sitting on this flat, nice, smooth, flat ledge. Yes. I could watch this one all day. I sent this to one of my students who's doing a project on rough-eye, and I sent this to her and occupied with it for an hour. And then you also see things like this. This is one of our really nice, big, what fishermen would call a red tree coral, Oregonian coral. This was I believe this was on the survey. So this little blank spot here was probably the trap was sitting there some time before that and has since moved. This particular trap, when the gear starts to get hauled, will get very active. And the one video I wanted to show for it, I couldn't get to play on this computer. But it starts to move, and you can imagine that it would just bowl that thing right over. This coral here is just sitting on a little rock that's about the size of a softball. So that thing has been just sitting there. And there's a few other corals out in the distance that we can barely see. So we've been using these up here on Skunk Kingless Bowie Seamount. And there's a little sablefish fishery up there that is allowed to operate inside this MPA. So this is one of the places that we thought would be a good place to put this technology to work and help the fishery operate in this area. So on this seamount, it's one of the few places we have very detailed bathymetry. And this is about 5-meter resolution bathymetry. And this line, that shows the limit of the marine protect area. So there's no fishing on the top of the seamount here. And then there's sablefish fishing by trap allowed on the outside. And it's an effort-limited fishery. So this is similar to the trawl. If you look at where the fishing has happened since 1990, so this is from 1990 to 1999, all the sets of fishing gear, trap gear around the seamount. And this is before the marine protect area went into place. So you can see there's a bit of a hot spot over here and a hot spot over here. But most of these strings are they're set in different directions, but there's a lot of coverage on that seamount. And over time, the effort has reduced a bit, and it's kind of moved, but see, there's that hot spot on that northwest area has been pretty heavily fished. And now you can see, now that the marine protect area is in there, there's almost very little happening up there. Some of these are positional errors, and the occasional one is some illegal fishing, but there's hardly any of it. So these are commercial trips, so there's no scientific survey that goes out there. There have been a couple, but they're very expensive to operate. So we got an observer to take these cameras out with the commercial fishing boat, and it turns out that the skippers really like putting cameras down because they get to see what the bottom's like, and they get something to do at night. This is fairly far offshore, and it's a nasty place to be. So if you can see some fun video, then they really worked hard this year to get these are these are actual fishing string locations, start and end point, and then there's a camera somewhere in there. It's not necessarily on the end, but everyone that has a camera on this string had a camera on that particular set. So I think in this last trip, about 60 out of 70 sets had cameras on them. And in 2 trips, we have these yellow squares. This is a 500-meter grid, and those yellow squares are places where we've actually collected some video. Now, this is a bit misleading because the amount of video that you actually get, you wouldn't see the point on that 500-meter grid. It would be about the size of a donut. If I just threw a donut into this room and said, okay, the area that around that donut is what this room is like, it would be a really misleading conclusion. So, we'd have to really cover this quite a bit with a lot of cameras. So one of the things that we'd like to do, that I'll mention later, is to get these cameras so they're smaller, cheaper, and we can put more of them per string and just start to get more information of it. So one of the things that we found is that about 20% of these cells actually have a coral or a sponge in it, and they come up in different, you can't really see on the screen, but there's a few different kinds of corals. The short Gorgonian coral, there's that big one I showed you before, the sponge, some little ones. But then we might ask, well, where are these things? So, where does this guy live? And with this high resolution bathymetry, this is basically the southwest edge of the seamount. And this is an actual start and end location overlaid on this thing. So you can see they set it fairly steeply going up the slope. And we know where the trap is, and so we can pretty much have a pretty good location on where these things are. So we have, to some degree, we can figure out where the actual organisms and colonies, if we find big colonies, we can actually see where they are. So that would allow us to do some presence-absence modeling and get much more detailed resolution on maps like these that we had in Hecate Strait, and really improve this because it'd be presence-absence data rather than just presence data. And then we could expand this pretty much to the entire coast because the cameras are going out every year on the Sable Fish Survey now, so we're getting up to 100 observations per year on the survey. So the other thing that I mentioned was those accelerometers, and you can basically try to keep track of what the trap is doing while it's when it leaves the boat. So this is an example. This is a time series going across, and on the left, this is where the trap is thrown over the side, and it takes about 20 minutes for a trap to get to the bottom if the water is fairly deep. And then the trap sits on the bottom for a long period of time, and then it's retrieved or hauled back. So this shows you the acceleration measurements in 3 axes, X, Y, and Z axes. You can see here as it's going down, it has a bit of activity, and then it settles for a long time while it's sitting on the bottom. A bit of, I don't know what this is. It could be that the trap is hung between two, like the trap actually isn't sitting on the bottom, that the line is hung between 2 ledges or something, and the trap is just waving in the tide, and then it settles down, and it picks back up, and then the gear is pulled back. And so what we've basically found from a lot of the videos, this is the time that really all the action happens. But you can take these time series, and we have lots of accelerometers, not just in the cameras, but we have other smaller units that are accelerometers that we spread along the gear. So one of the things you can do, if you have 100 of these data sets, you can try to classify them and say, well, do they break out into certain types of behavior? So this is an example with about 70 accelerometers, a little cluster, just a basic cluster analysis on the time series. So this graph is over time, which you don't really have to pay attention to the time. This is around the beginning of the set. So this is this period here. And then the y-axis here is the acceleration in g's. So a g of 1, that's gravity. So if they're just sitting still, they'll have a g of 1. A g of 1.14 is equivalent to a Saturn V moon rocket. So, this isn't a trivial scale, is what I'm trying to tell you. It doesn't seem like a lot, but gravity is pretty strong. Accelerating at 1.14 meters per second squared, right? Pretty tough. So this deployment, you can see there's a bunch of these cluster into a particular type of behavior. Now, I don't have some video to show you for that because the videos are delayed for 22 hours, so we don't actually get much of that. But this shows you two types of clusters, one where there's some actual action going on, and another one that's fairly quiet, a group that's fairly quiet. So these are a bit more interesting. This is during the soak, and you can see during the soak, it's quite a bit quieter. That Saturn rocket is up here somewhere, so this is fairly small movement. Not totally insignificant, but... And then this is the video showing you just basically it's a representative clip from that particular group. So this just shows you the trap dragging along the bottom. One of the things you get from this is you can hear the audio, and the audio tells you other things about the bottom, whether it's soft or hard. So there's a lot of information that's being output from that. And then this is a quieter one that's sitting fairly still. This, as the lights come on, you can see this is just nice flat mud bottom here, and the trap is just kind of sitting there and moving in the tide a little bit, but not really doing much. And then this is when the real action happens. Here's the Saturn rocket, so we've got a little bit of action going on, and got one by hand. And so that top one, what you see is the gear picking up, rolling over on its side, and flopping back down. So you can see that it's a fairly hard ledge. There's the ground line there. And again, you can hear the audio, so you can tell that this is hard bottom. There are some cases where you can't see anything. There's so much debris floating around that you can't tell what the bottom is actually like, but that video tells you that it's hard or soft bottom or has some gravels on it. We actually got the interest of one of our people in computer science at SFU to try to process that data to make it. There really isn't a lot of machine learning algorithms developed for audio. Okay, so let's turning that into a risk assessment. I'm going to move fairly quickly here, but the idea, if we take those different types of trap movements and say, well, how much area would they contact for those different types of movements? But this shows you, a student of mine did the calculation. So if the string of trap gear is just sitting static on the bottom, and it's a 4-kilometer long string, it's just sitting there, then it occupies an area of about 96 square meters, which is not very much. And then if it starts to drag, it drags the way that dragging trap was this way, that goes up to about 5,500 square meters contacted. And then if it drags this way and sways back and forth, then it goes up to almost 50,000 square meters. Now, all of that is still relatively small compared to a trawl footprint, which is about 280,000 square meters, 4 kilometers by 70 meters. So all of these are quite a bit smaller than the trawl impact, but nonetheless, if they happen, if you put the gear in an area where there's a lot of kind of sensitive habitats, then it could be fairly significant. So we did a little simulation of this on using those fishing effort patterns from Bowie Seamount that I showed you. And so this is just an idealized simulation. We haven't put it to some really good data on sponge distributions, but just to get an idea of what might happen. So this is from 1986 to 2004. We took those trap fishing effort data from Bowie Seamount, and we did some simulations with the different dragging and movement patterns, and we had some hypothetical sponge grounds on there, and we looked at how much of that sponge remains after this almost 20 years of fishing. And so that if you were fishing by trawl, you would have about a 20% decline by trawl. And then for those different scenarios, the decline, the sway and drag, the drag and the static, you'd have less than 4% impact on this kind of situation. So it might be higher if you find out that there's areas where the fishing effort is concentrated is where the corals and sponges are, then those things will have to be dealt with. So to put this together, I wanted to give you my vision of the way this technology is going in the future and what I think we could do with it. And I really think it can really help us in a lot of other ways besides just dealing with habitat issues. You know, we're getting new kinds of data, we're putting out new types of technology, and so this is, you know, what I would like to see the next generation of sea drop system cameras and accelerometers. They collect some physical data, which depth they already do. Temperature, they get a crude measure of temperature, and possibly flow. And I don't know if you saw that weird device that was dragging on the bottom in one of the traps. That was our terrible attempt at putting a flow meter down to measure current speed. But there's probably ways to do it using some kind of automated vision kind of things. But those three pieces of information, those are some of the key things that determine coral and sponge presence absence. That's the data that you need. And then we could have actual presence absence from the video and the photos. Get the spatial distribution of them, diversity and so on. The other thing that I really thought, well, if I can put a camera out, why can't I put out a hydrophone? And so I did that this year. And so we put a hydrophone out on the Sable fish survey. And so then we could have actual fish tracking on that fairly massive scale, which would help us learn a lot about fish movement. And then the things I was just showing you about the gear. So we could start to look at low impact fishing methods and all those other benefits that we could get from that. So finally, I think, you know, as our ability, you know, technology and data are kind of taking over the world, and I think it's time we bring them into fisheries rather than being data poor, we might start to be somewhat data rich. And so we can apply that obviously to this kind of context, but there's other things we can do, like avoid non-target fish species, fish that are endangered and threatened and so on. And I think pretty much getting involved with industry has benefited me because it's helping me to move fisheries towards more of an ecosystem-based approach that has value to them. And I think when you do that, you get better solutions that way. Thanks.
Run out of time. There's a class coming in, but we're going to move to 107. So bring your lunch and come join us if you have any questions. Sean's going to hang out for a little bit longer. So thank you very much.
Thank you.